Hey everybody, thanks for tuning in to Test 2 Plus again. I am Trace. This is episode 2 of 5 on immigration. We're going to break it down from what a citizen is to all different terms about immigration, even whether globalization has made immigration worse, quote unquote, or better, quote unquote. But today, we're going to talk a little bit about the difference between some of the terms that you're going to hear when you talk about immigration. Before we get to that, I want to tell a quick story. When I was living back in Michigan, this was probably in the mid to late 2000s, I was working in northern Michigan and I was moving from one place to another. And I thought I would visit my friend who lived in Canada because it's actually kind of on the way. And in some ways, you can drive through Michigan, go to Canada, come back into Michigan again, and you saved time. That's how Michigan and Canada are so close to each other. So what I did is I drove to the border of Canada and I had my car full of stuff. And I got to the border, and the border guards were very confused as to why I had so many things in my car. So they made me take everything out, and they searched it all because they thought that I was going to try and illegally enter Canada and stay there and maybe work or something like that. Long story short, I passed the border. It was no big deal. But the woman took me to the office, and she sat me down, and she looked at my passport, and she said, "Okay, here's the deal. You are now a Canadian immigrant. You have 10 days in our country, at which point you have to leave Canada in order to get any kind of work visa." And I'm just thinking, I'm just visiting my friend for like the weekend. I don't really need all this stuff. And she continued to tell me about how it is to immigrate to Canada. And I was so confused, but essentially I accidentally immigrated for 10 days to Canada. It was very strange. But they're very concerned for the same reason the United States is concerned, because immigration is a hot button topic, and different people go to countries other than their own for different reasons. So for example, a migrant is a person who makes a conscious choice to leave their country. Maybe they're seeking a better life elsewhere, but before they decide to leave their country, sometimes they'll study the language that they're going to have to learn or know when they get there, explore employment opportunities. Maybe they planned some kind of travel. They bought plane tickets of some kind, or take their belongings with them. Maybe they shipped them in advance. They could also say goodbye to important people in their lives. They're saying, "I am leaving our country. I'm going to go seek a better life in Canada for 10 days," or whatever. Basically, the distinction here is that migrants can return to their homes at any time. They're voluntarily leaving to go somewhere else to try their hand at living in the United States, living somewhere in Europe, living somewhere in Asia. It can be anywhere. It's not any one country that someone migrates to or from. It just means they're moving from one place to another. Now, on the other hand, refugees, they're forced to leave their country. Refugees is something you're seeing a lot in the news right now because there are a lot of people being forced out of nations like Syria. And they have risks of prosecution, perhaps. Refugees have concerns over human rights and safety. They're not usually moving for economic advantage. They're being forced out. Usually, refugees leave most of their belongings behind. They leave family members and their friends, or they are with their family members and friends because they were all forced to leave together. Some are forced to flee with no warning whatsoever, so all they have is what they were carrying. Many have experienced significant trauma. Some have been tortured. Some have been ill-treated. The path of travel is usually dangerous for refugees. They usually didn't choose their method of travel, unlike migrants who can buy plane tickets or a boat ticket to go there. People who are refugees are forced into some other path that they may not have picked for themselves. And this might involve risking their life, because the whole point of being a refugee is it was dangerous there, so I'm either leaving because I want to be more safe, or I'm leaving because the environment has forced me to do so. The distinction between a migrant and a refugee is that refugees can't return to where they came from unless that situation has changed and probably improved. So, just to be clear, a migrant left voluntarily, probably for a better situation. Refugees are leaving for a better situation, maybe, but the idea is they're trying to protect themselves and their friends and family. Now, on top of that, we have asylum seekers. This is something you see a lot in old movies, but it's a real political distinction. An asylum seeker is someone who has sought protection as a refugee, but whose claim for refugee status has not yet been assessed. Essentially, Every refugee was an asylum seeker at some point, but not all asylum seekers are refugees because they haven't been granted that status. Because, again, these are political things. These are things that we've defined later. Every refugee has been an asylum seeker. Failure to become refugees can also mean fines. It could mean imprisonment. Depending on what country you live in, people who are asylum seekers who aren't granted refugee status aren't always treated that well. Asylum seekers who are found to be refugees, though, they're entitled to international protection and assistance. So let's use the United States, for example. Not to toot our own horn, but the United States is pretty good at handling these situations. We go above and beyond. It all started when we took in 250,000 displaced Europeans after World War II. The U.S. Congress passed the Displaced Persons Act of 1948, which helped an additional 400,000 displaced Europeans during its time. Our policies and laws have evolved since then, of course, but we're still a pretty major player in the refugee status situation worldwide. In the first 30 to 90 days after a refugee's arrival in the United States, they're given food, housing, clothing, employment services, and medical care. All refugees under the age of 18 who arrive in the United States may attend public, primary, or secondary schools free of charge, the same as a regular citizen or resident of the U.S. Refugees have the same access to university education as United States citizens and permanent residents, and all refugees are entitled to receive authorization for employment. But they can't work for the federal government, except in the U.S. Armed Forces, perhaps, until they become U.S. citizens. So, in the end, refugees versus asylum seekers versus migrants all has to do with, one, where they came from, why they came there, and then how the country that they've come to recognizes them. It's about international law, international politics, and policy. It sounds pretty boring and complicated, but if you look at the stories of these people, you're talking about some pretty serious stuff. This can make or break someone's whole life, and it can take years to move from being an asylum seeker to a refugee in some cases. And that just seems awful, because people are sitting there, often in some place that's been designated for people that are refugees or asylum seekers in a lot of countries, and they're not in the best conditions. They don't have all of their belongings, or maybe even any of them, and they're just making do with what they have, maybe with no jobs, maybe with a job if they're lucky in the country that they're in. This is serious stuff, and it affects people every single day all around the world. And most people don't even know the difference between many of these different terms. So hopefully this helped. But in the end, why the heck are different countries taking care of strangers? This is a question that people have, right? Does it make you kind of upset that people who come to the United States get food, housing, clothing, employment services, access to education, access to employment? Does that make you upset? Why don't you tell us about it down in the comments? We're going to come back to this tomorrow and talk a little bit about what happens when countries are hostile to immigration. Not every country follows the US's lead. There are some places you just don't want to end up in. So we'll talk about that tomorrow on Test 2 Plus. So stay tuned for part 3. Make sure you subscribe. You can do that by clicking here on the screen. You can come follow me on Twitter at Trace Dominguez if you want to talk more about this. And I will see you tomorrow on Test 2 Plus.